Beth Harton knelt in the red dust of Red Willow Crossing as the last light of evening bled across the valley, her hands shaking over a fire no bigger than a man's palm. The wind cut through her torn dress like a blade, yet she stayed there, feeding the flame with the stubbornness of someone who had run out of miracles long before she ran out of tears. The cracked clay pot balanced above the flicker was all she owned now, and inside it simmered the final handful of beans she had saved from 3 days of walking. The scent drifted into the empty plaza, soft and warm, a heartbreaking echo of the home she once dared to imagine. Footsteps shuffled. An old man paused at the edge of her fire, his lined face frozen as the smell touched him. The wind of the Dakota Territory swept low across the plains, carrying the metallic chill of early dusk and the drifting scent of the red willow trees that fringed the settlement. Red Willow Crossing was a lonely strip of cabins and storefronts pressed close to the creek, their roofs bowing each time the gusts rolled in. Twilight stretched across the plaza, brushing the dirt with long strokes of rust and gray. Beth Harton crouched beside her fire, its trembling glow illuminating a face shaped by years of surviving quiet storms rather than open battles. Strands of hair clung to her temples, tangled from days of walking, yet it was her eyes that held the story few dared to ask. They were soft in color, but hardened at the edges, reflecting nights spent listening to footsteps staggering across a wooden floor, the flare of anger in a husband's voice, and the metallic crash of bottles shattered against walls. Owen Harton had not been a cruel man at first, not in the way that leaves bruises, but the drink had taken him little by little, hollowing him into someone Beth no longer recognized. What began as apologies whispered into her hair became curses muttered into her skin. And soon her world shrank to the radius of his temper. She learned to move quietly, learned which floorboards groaned beneath her feet, learned to keep her voice low. The burns on her hands came not from her own clumsiness, but from snatching hot pans too quickly whenever he lurched into the kitchen roaring for food. She remembered pressing her back to the wall, counting his breaths until he passed out. She remembered being grateful for the silence, even when it smelled of stale whiskey. The debts came later. Cards, bets, backroom wagers, names she never heard until men in dark coats arrived at their door after Owen collapsed one night and never woke. Beth had no time to mourn. In the span of 7 days, the collectors stripped her life bare. They took the table where she once kneaded dough, the trunk of linen she inherited from her mother, even the curtain she had sewn during her first month of marriage. They walked through her home as if it belonged to them. And in truth, by then it did. Only 3 objects remained: the skillet Owen never bothered to sell, the cracked clay pot she used to cook her first meal as a wife, and the wooden spoon that had turned countless soups when she still believed her marriage could be saved. Beth kept them not as mementos of him, but as the last pieces of herself. She slipped the few coins they missed into the lining of her dress and stepped outside, leaving the house behind without turning back. Now, in Red Willow Crossing, she stirred her modest pot of beans with the same spoon that had survived her old life. Folks watched her with suspicion or unease. News of her past had traveled ahead of her, and frontier towns were swift to shut their doors against misfortune, especially misfortune wearing a woman's face. Women ushered their children indoors. Men avoided her with curt nods. Beth understood their hesitance. A widow of a drunk gambler was trouble no one wanted near. The old man who approached her fire was the first soul in days who looked at her without judgment. His boots were worn, his knuckles knotted with age, but his gaze held nothing but weary kindness. He accepted the bowl she offered and ate with the reverence of someone tasting a long-lost memory. When he asked about her life, Beth spoke with halting honesty: the drinking, the rage, the debts, the days of fleeing with nothing but fear and a few hidden coins. She did not embellish, she did not excuse. When she finished, the old man nodded slow and heavy, as if her words settled into a place in him that had long been empty. He told her of a ranch 15 miles north, a place tucked among red willows and rising hills, Creighton Ranch, a place run by a man who carried his own sorrow like a second shadow. The trail leading north from Red Willow Crossing climbed steadily through low hills veined with red willow roots. Beth moved carefully along the narrow path, the cracked pot tied to her bundle clicking softly against the skillet with each step. The morning light spread thin across the land, touching the creek with a silver sheen and revealing a vast stretch of open prairie broken only by stands of weather-twisted trees. Her legs ached from days of travel, but the old man's words lingered in her mind like a fragile promise. Creighton Ranch, a place that might let her start again. By the time she reached the ridge overlooking the valley, the sun had climbed high enough to burn through the mist. Below her lay the ranch larger than she expected, with a sprawling barn, sturdy corrals, and a long main house made of dark timber. Smoke rose from a chimney somewhere behind it, drifting sideways in the wind. Beth paused, hands tightening around the strap of her bundle. She felt the familiar squeeze of fear press against her ribs, the kind that whispered she was unworthy of any new beginning. But the memory of 7 empty days after Owen's death pushed her onward. She descended into the valley with her heart beating unevenly. The first man who noticed her was a broad-shouldered ranch hand stacking fence rails near the gate. He straightened slowly, his brow knitting as she approached. "You lost," Ma'am Beth swallowed, fighting the urge to step back. No, sir, I'm looking for work. I was told the ranch might need a cook." 2 more men emerged from behind the barn, wiping their hands on their trousers as they joined the first. Their glances flicked over her torn dress, her worn boots, her exhausted posture, not cruel glances, but doubtful glances that said a woman like her was not built for a place like this. One of them let out a humorless laugh. "You're here for the kitchen, lady. The boss doesn't keep cooks long." The words struck her harder than intended, but Beth straightened her back. "I'd like to speak to him," she said quietly. The ranch hands looked at each other, ready to dismiss her, when a heavy door creaked open. The sound cut across the yard with a weight that silenced all 3 men. Beth turned. A tall figure stepped from the shadow of the porch. Marshall Creighton walked with the certainty of someone who had long commanded both land and men. The wind tugged at the edges of his coat, revealing the breadth of his frame, the strength in his shoulders, and the quiet severity etched across his face. His eyes dark, steady, carrying something older than grief, stopped her breath for a moment. There was no anger in them, but no softness either. They were the eyes of a man who had buried more than one kind of sorrow. He approached slowly, boots crunching through the red dust. "What's going on here?" he asked, his voice low and evenly measured. The ranch hand pointed. "She's asking for work. Says she can cook." Marshall's gaze shifted to Beth fully, and the air around her felt colder. He didn't look at her clothes or her bundle first. He looked at her hands burned in places, roughened in others' hands that had known labor far heavier than they should have. Then his gaze lifted to her face, reading something she couldn't hide. "You're looking for a position?" he asked. Beth forced her voice steady. "Yes, sir. I can cook well. I was told you might need help." Marshall crossed his arms. "Many claim they can. Few do. And fewer last." His tone wasn't mocking, just tired, as if the statement had been proven enough times that it no longer carried emotion. Beth felt a tremor rise in her chest, but she held firm. "I only need a chance to show you." A long silence followed. The ranch hands waited, exchanging uneasy glances. Wind rustled through the willows near the creek, somewhere distant. A horse snorted, finally. Marshall spoke. "1 week." Beth blinked. "You cook for 7 days." He continued. "If your food is worth keeping, you stay. If not, you leave after sundown on the 7th. Relief swept through her so suddenly that her knees weakened. "Yes, sir. Thank you." Marshall didn't acknowledge her gratitude. He simply called out, "Evan, show her the kitchen, and give her the small room near the east shed," as the ranch hand motioned for her to follow. Beth stole a final glance at Marshall Creighton. He had turned away already, heading back toward the barn, the weight of something unseen bending slightly at his shoulders. She couldn't name it then, but she sensed that beneath his sternness was a wound that had never fully closed, one that might be older and deeper than her own. Beth rose before the first flicker of dawn touched Red Willow Valley. The room she had been given was barely wider than the cot inside it, but to her it felt safer than any space she had known for years. The thin blanket carried the faint scent of cedar, and the small window let in a cold stream of morning air. She sat on the edge of the cot for a moment, steadying her breath before pushing herself up. Today mattered. Every dish, every gesture, every second she stood in that kitchen mattered. The kitchen was dark when she entered, save for a sliver of moonlight cutting through the high window. She lit the lantern carefully, then knelt to coax the fire in the stove awake. The smell of dry wood catching flame filled the room, mingling with the faint aroma of flour sacks stacked neatly along the shelves. Beth let her hands glide over the ingredients as if reacquainting herself with something sacred. Cooking had always given her a strange, fragile peace, even in her old life. Stirring a pot or kneading dough was the one moment when her husband's voice could not reach her. Here, in this new place, that peace returned like a timid friend stepping back into the light. She started with biscuits, working the dough gently, despite the stiffness in her fingers. Then she cracked eggs into a bowl, whisked them with fresh milk, sliced onions, and set strips of cured pork to sizzle. As the scents layered browning meat, warm bread, pepper, and smoke, the kitchen transformed. It felt alive again. Beth felt alive again. When the ranch hands filed in at dawn, rubbing sleep from their eyes, they stopped short. The long wooden table held steaming platters, and the air shimmered with warmth no one had expected. Evan, the same man who guided her the day before, picked up a biscuit with the suspicion of someone who had been disappointed before. The moment he bit into it, he froze. Then his expression shifted into something like wonder. "Good Lord," he whispered. Others followed, and soon the sound of forks striking plates filled the room. Conversation rose, laughter came easier, and for the first time in years, Beth heard the sound of men talking without anger rippling beneath their voices. She kept her gaze low, moving quietly between the stove and the table. Yet she felt their glances respectful now, not dismissive. But there was one man missing, Marshall Creighton. Beth prepared his tray differently, arranging the food with an instinctive care she didn't fully understand. She added a small dish of spiced apples, something she hadn't tasted in years but remembered as a comfort during long winters. When Evan carried the tray off to Marshall's office, Beth found herself listening for footsteps that didn't come. In his study, Marshall sat surrounded by tools, ledgers, and the faint smell of saddle oil. He barely looked up when Evan entered. "Leave it there," he muttered. But when Evan left, the aroma reached him: warm bread, onions, and something sweet underneath. Marshall hesitated, the muscles in his jaw tightening. Food had been a battlefield since the fire 6 years ago. The kitchen had been where Mary cooked his birthday supper, where she'd laughed God. She had laughed right before flames swallowed the room, and he had carried her limp body out into the rain. Some days, even the smell of bread made him feel the weight of loss sitting on his chest like a stone. Still, he reached for the biscuit. The first bite surprised him. It was crisp on the outside, tender inside, and tasted like something he had forgotten existed. Care. He tried the eggs next, then the apples. Without meaning to, he finished everything. When he placed the fork down, he stared at the empty tray for a long time, unmoving. Was it the food, or was it the person who made it later that afternoon? When the men gathered for their midday meal, Marshall appeared at the doorway. The room fell silent at once. Beth didn't look up at first, focusing on stirring the pot before her. But she felt him there, his presence filling the space like thunder just beyond the ridge. She finally lifted her gaze. Marshall's eyes met hers briefly, and something flickered in them: a shadow, a question, a memory. The days that followed unfolded slowly, like pages turning under careful hands. Beth found her rhythm. She learned which spices the men liked, which ones made them wrinkle their noses. She discovered that Marshall preferred strong coffee without sugar, and that he barely touched food unless it was placed before him without comment. She prepared his tray with quiet mindfulness each morning and evening, yet he seldom stepped into the kitchen. He lingered near the doorway sometimes, offering brief nods before moving on. But Beth noticed how he always paused, just long enough for the scent of cooking to touch him. One afternoon, as she chopped vegetables, she sensed someone behind her. She turned and saw Marshall standing a few paces away, arms crossed, eyes fixed on her hands as they moved deftly across the cutting board. "You work hard," he said, voice low. Beth nearly dropped the knife. I do what's needed, sir." Marshall nodded once. His gaze drifted to the crooked table in the corner of her small room, visible through the open door beyond the kitchen. "That table of yours, the legs uneven." Beth blinked. "It doesn't bother me. I'll fix it," he said simply. Before she could respond, he was already stepping out into the yard. She stood frozen for a moment, then found herself smiling small, almost shy. No one had fixed anything for her in years. The next morning, the table stood straight and sturdy. A new shelf had been added to the wall. Later, a mirror appeared above the basin. Each improvement came without announcement. Marshall Creighton might have kept grief locked behind iron walls, but his actions betrayed something gentler. Not all days were gentle, though some ranch hands, emboldened by youth, let their tongues slip. Beth was accustomed to enduring crude remarks, to shrinking from male voices. But here, the shame hit differently. She was trying. She was rebuilding. And their laughter sliced through her newfound confidence like a knife. On the fourth morning, as she served breakfast, one of the younger men leaned back in his chair and said something low and suggestive. Laughter erupted. Beth froze. the ladle trembling in her hand. Before she could speak, a sharp voice cut through the room. "That's enough." Marshall stood in the doorway, his expression cold as winter stone. Silence crashed over the room. "She is here to work," he said, stepping forward. "She will be treated with respect. One more word out of line, and you're gone. Make yourselves clear." "Yes, sir." The chorus of voices murmured. Marshall's gaze shifted to Beth, softer now, almost apologetic. She felt something tighten in her chest. Fear, yes, but also something else. Gratitude, recognition, a sense that for the first time in years, someone stood between her and harm that night. She prepared Marshall's supper with even greater care. When Evan returned with the tray, he carried a message. "The boss says everything was perfect." She held his words close like a small ember of warmth, day by day. Something unspoken grew between them. They did not cross lines. They did not linger in rooms together. But a current passed in the quiet moments, a glance, a pause, a breath. Beth began to sense that beneath Marshall's hardened exterior was a man fighting ghosts, and perhaps, without knowing, she was beginning to help him fight them. Storm clouds had been gathering since noon, thickening into a bruised mass that pressed low over Red Willow Valley. The wind changed first, sweeping across the prairie in hard, uneven bursts that bent the tall grasses and rattled the loose boards along the barn walls. Beth felt the shift while preparing the evening meal, the heaviness of the air settling on her skin like a warning. She paused, listening to the distant rumble rolling down from the hills. Storms in the Dakota Territory were unpredictable. They struck fast, burned bright, and left ruin behind. Outside, the ranch hands hurried to secure tools, tighten ropes, and bring the horses in before the rain hit. Beth's heart fluttered as thunder cracked, echoing through the kitchen walls. She kept working, slicing vegetables, stirring a pot already simmering with savory broth. Trying to focus on the rhythm of her hands, cooking grounded her. It had always grounded her, even in her old life. When Owen staggered through their home with rage in his breath, she would cling to the wooden spoon, hold it firm, as if it were the only thing keeping her from breaking. A sudden streak of white light split the sky, followed closely by a blast so violent it shook the window panes. Beth gasped and dropped the spoon. A moment later, shouts erupted in the yard. Fire, the storage sheds hit. Her breath stopped. Flames were already climbing the side of the structure near the barn, licking through the brittle hay stacked against its wall. Beth rushed to the doorway, gripping the frame as the heat washed over her. The fire spread rapidly, feeding on the dry wood and windswept sparks. Men scrambled for buckets, stumbling over each other in frantic motion. Horses screamed inside the stable, hooves pounding wildly against the stalls, and in the center of it all stood Marshall Creighton motionless. Beth saw him clearly from the porch. His face had drained of color, his broad shoulders, usually squared and steady, sagged under a weight invisible to everyone but him. The firelight flickered across his eyes, awakening a memory he could not escape. He wasn't looking at the flames. He was looking through them into the past, into the burning kitchen where Mary had stood with flour on her apron and laughter on her lips before smoke swallowed her whole. Beth's own breath hitched. She recognized the expression, the blankness of someone drowning in a memory they cannot fight. She had seen it in herself on nights when Owen's voice rose in her dreams. But Marshall's stillness carried something deeper guilt, sharpened into torment. A ranch hand ran toward him. "Boss, "What are your orders, boss?" But Marshall didn't hear him. His hands hung useless at his sides, fingers trembling as the fire roared higher. He whispered something. Beth couldn't hear it, but she thought she saw a name form on his lips. Mary. Another explosion snapped through the yard as a beam collapsed inside the shed. Sparks shot into the air. Flames leapt toward the barn roof. A man cursed loudly, panic breaking the thin line of control. Beth stepped forward before she realized she was moving. She felt heat pulse against her face, felt the old fear claw up her throat, the fear of fire, of yelling, of chaos. Memories of Owen's rage flashed, the slamming doors, the broken glass, the helplessness. But this time, something steadier rose inside her. Maybe it came from the long miles she had walked alone. Maybe from the mornings she cooked for men who finally looked at her without contempt. Maybe from the way Marshall had stood between her and cruelty. Whatever it was, it drove her forward. She climbed onto a wooden crate so her voice would carry. "Everyone, listen!" Head snapped toward her. Even the horses stilled for a moment, as if sensing the shift in the air. "You fetch water from the creek. 2 lines. Move fast." She pointed to the older hands first, knowing they'd respond quickly. "You 3 get those horses out now. Open the east doors so they don't trample each other. You." She turned to Evan. "Pull Marshall away from the fire. Now, don't argue." Evan didn't question her. He ran to Marshall, grabbed him by the shoulders, and forced him back. Marshall resisted weakly at first, eyes fixed on the fire, on the scene replaying in his mind. But his knees finally buckled, and Evan dragged him clear of falling debris. Beth tied a damp cloth around her mouth and sprinted into the chaos. She positioned herself between the bucket line and the barn, shouting instructions, urging the men to keep rhythm. Water splashed across her arms, scorching from the heat above, yet freezing from the creek below. Smoke clawed at her eyes. Ash clung to her clothes, singeing holes into the fabric. Twice she stumbled. Twice she pushed herself up again. "Faster," she called. "Don't let it reach the stable." The flames crackled and hissed as water continued to pour over them. She could feel her skin burning where sparks landed. But she kept going. None of this compared to the fire she had lived inside for years. Minutes felt like hours. A beam sagged dangerously overhead, and someone shouted her name, warning her to move. She ducked just as it crashed behind her, spraying embers across the dirt. For a second she coughed violently, knees buckling. Then she forced herself upright and shouted again for the men to keep the line moving. At last, the fire began to shrink, beaten back by sheer will and gallons of creek water. The roaring softened to cracking embers. Smoke thinned into drifting wisps. The shed was ruined, but the barn stood intact. The horses were safe. The men, though exhausted, were alive. Beth's strength faded all at once. She stood still for a moment. Then her legs gave way, dropping her into the dirt. She braced her hands on the ground, breath shaking. Her palms were raw. The skin blistered where steam had seared it. The yard was quiet now. Marshall sat near the well, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. When he looked up, Beth saw tears streak through the soot on his face, shining in the dim light. He looked at her as though he had never seen her before. She forced herself to stand, each movement a protest of aching muscles, and walked toward him. Evan stepped aside when she approached. Beth knelt beside Marshall, voice soft. "It's over. You're safe. Everyone's safe." Marshall swallowed hard, unable to speak. His grief lay open and raw in his eyes, years of guilt, fear, and love that had nowhere to go. "You did what I couldn't," he whispered finally, voice cracking. I saw the fire and I went back there. Beth reached out and placed her hand gently on his arm. No one could blame you for remembering, but you're still here. And the ranch is still here. Because of you. And because all of us fought together. Thunder rumbled far off in the distance. Softer now, like a fading echo. Marshall lowered his head, breathing in raggedly. Beth stayed close, not touching him more than that one careful gesture, but steady, present, unafraid. The storm that had started in the sky was finally dying. But the storm inside Marshall Creighton had just begun to calm for the first time in 6 long years. Night wrapped itself around Red Willow Valley in a deep, settling quiet. The fire had been put out, the men had returned to their bunks, and only faint threads of smoke drifted across the yard. Beth washed her burned hands at the pump, wincing at the sting, but accepting the pain the way she accepted the rest of her life without complaint. When she stepped onto the back porch, she saw Marshall sitting alone, shoulders bowed, the brim of his hat beside him. Moonlight revealed the soot smeared across his face and the strain still caught around his eyes. He didn't look like the stern rancher she had met days ago. He looked lost. "You shouldn't be out here," he said quietly. "You're hurt. I'll manage," she answered, taking a seat a short distance from him. "Burns heal." He looked toward the barn, jaw tight. I froze. I saw the fire and it was like I was standing in that kitchen again. Beth stayed silent, giving him room. "She died in that kitchen," he murmured, "6 years ago, on my birthday. She had flour on her hands. I can still see it, the way it clung to her sleeves when the flames caught." Beth felt her heart tighten. She didn't interrupt. She let him speak. "I dragged her out," he continued. "She had saved 2 of the hands who were trapped inside. She was always stronger than I deserved. By the time I got her out, she could barely breathe. She died with her head in my lap." His voice shook. "And I've been trying not to remember her last breath ever since." Beth's own voice softened. "Pain doesn't disappear just because we bury it. It waits." He turned to her then, really seeing her. "And you walked into that fire. I walked into worse before," she said simply. "What happened tonight, it wasn't weakness. It was memory. I know what it feels like when the past reaches for you." His eyes lingered on the scars along her hands, the ones older than today's burns. "He hurt you." Beth nodded once, "For years. And I believed I deserved it. I stayed because fear teaches you to stay." "You didn't deserve any of it," he said, his voice low but certain. The porch fell quiet. The sound of the creek whispered beneath the willows, and the night felt warmer somehow. "We both survived things that were meant to break us," Beth said softly. Marshall drew a long breath, steady for the first time since the fire. Maybe surviving isn't enough anymore. Their eyes held no fear, no walls, just the fragile beginning of something neither had dared imagine. The next evening unfolded with a gentleness that neither Beth nor Marshall expected. The storm had washed the valley clean, leaving the air cool and sweet with the scent of wet willow leaves. Dusk gathered slowly, tinting the creek with streaks of rose and silver. Beth stood near the water's edge, watching the current slip past smooth stones, her reflection wavering on the surface like something still learning to steady itself. She didn't hear Marshall approach, but she felt the shift in the air when he stopped beside her. He didn't speak at first. He simply stood there, hands in his coat pockets, breathing in the quiet with her, for once. His presence didn't feel heavy. It felt right. "I've been thinking," he said finally, his voice low, careful. About yesterday. About years before that, too. Beth turned slightly. You don't owe me an explanation. I'm not trying to explain, he replied. I'm trying to understand myself. And I think, somewhere along the way, I let grief swallow the man I used to be. He paused, searching the creek as if the words he needed might be drifting along with the water. But when you stood in front of that fire, when you fought for this place, you reminded me that life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just keeps going. And we either rise with it or stay buried. Beth's breath caught at the earnestness in his tone. She had spent years being spoken to in anger, indifference, or contempt. This quiet truth felt like a language she hadn't heard in a very long time. Marshall turned toward her fully. Beth, when you arrived here and said those words, I'm not worth much, sir, but I can cook. You were so wrong. Everything you've done, your courage, your kindness, your strength, you've brought light back into a place I thought would stay dark forever. Beth swallowed hard. I didn't mean to change anything. You did, he said softly. You changed me. A breeze moved through the red willows, their branches brushing together with a sound like distant applause. Beth looked at Marshall's outstretched hand, not demanding, not assuming, simply offered. When she placed her hand in his, it trembled only once before settling. They stood like that, fingers intertwined, as the creek shimmered beneath the rising moon and the red willow leaves swayed around them like silent witnesses. In that moment, Creighton Ranch was no longer a place marked by loss. It was a place beginning to breathe again.